My name is Evgeny Rusakov and you're watching TVP World, interview from Vilnius. On the 1st of August, a prisoner exchange took place between Russia, Belarus and Western countries. Amongst the 16 people that Russia released was a famous Russian opposition politician, Ilya Yashin, which was sentenced to 8.5 years in Russian prison and which has joined us for our today's program.
Hello, Ilya. I am very glad to have you with us today.
Hello.
Ilya, I guess the first question is probably the one that you are asked most often in principle, and I won't be an exception in that respect. How are you feeling almost 2 months after the prisoner exchange?
Well, much better than 2 months ago.
That's for sure.
2 months ago I was behind bars and now I'm a free man. 2 months ago I had to walk with my hands behind my back. Now I can walk where I want and how I want. 2 months ago I had to ask in writing to be able to call my parents and that request was usually denied. Now I can call my parents anytime I want. Not so long ago they gave me a visit. I was able to hug my mom for the first time in a long time. So, well, of course, freedom is better than lack of freedom. And even though I'm now forced to live abroad against my will, I certainly enjoy my freedom. Although morally it is still quite hard, because many of my comrades, Russian political prisoners, remain behind bars, including people I know personally, for whom I care very much. And this is a burden. The fact that people are suffering, the fact that people remain literally rotting behind bars, this is, of course, very disturbing. And I want to make sure that they are freed too.
Tell me, please, the attitude towards political prisoners in Russian prisons. Is it significantly different from the attitude towards other people who are imprisoned under some other articles?
A question about the administration, I guess.
Yes, absolutely.
The administration treats political prisoners very cautiously, and almost all political prisoners face pressure and harassment in detention centers. Because every political prisoner is seen as a potential rebel, as a potential disruptor of the penal system. Plus, there is pressure, as a rule, on some particularly well-known political prisoners. There is pressure from Moscow to keep people arrested for politics quiet. Do not make political speeches in courts, do not try to somehow contact journalists from behind bars, and so on. That is why almost all political prisoners go through punishment cells, known as shizo. Practically all political prisoners are subjected to some sort of pressure. Some are simply isolated and are not allowed to communicate with other detainees at all. They use methods of psychological pressure, limit their ability to call their relatives, family, children. They disrupt visits, limit deliveries, and so on. In fact, the rules of internal order in Russian prisons give the administration a very wide range of tools to exert pressure on prisoners. And political prisoners always face this pressure.
Ilya,
you are basically one of the most prominent, most significant representatives of the Russian opposition that is currently abroad. How do you assess the effectiveness of the Russian opposition, which again criticizes the Kremlin and yet is abroad?
Well, objectively speaking, at the moment the effectiveness is certainly not very high, because the situation in Russian opposition, in emigration in particular, is far from ideal. There are a lot of conflicts, a lot of clashes, opinions, interests, and so on. It seems to me very important, of course, to somehow bring our positions closer together, to consolidate, not even at the level of politicians, but at the level of our supporters. Because the biggest problem I see is the disunity of people who want to do something to stop the war, who are ready to make effort to remove Putin from power, so that changes in Russia could begin. But our disunity in general, of course, severely limits our possibilities. That is why I see my role in bringing our positions closer together, in consolidating people, in developing some mechanisms for collective action. I realize that this sounds like a rather extravagant idea now, given the situation of the opposition, but I will try to motivate people by personal example.
Do you think that the Russian opposition, the opposition that is abroad, has any options at all to influence the internal politics of the Russian Federation?
Well, as long as we have the ability to communicate our point of view to Russian citizens through social media, through YouTube,
Which, by the way, is about to be blocked completely.
Despite all the attempts and blocking mechanisms, we still have chance to be heard by our compatriots in Russia. And the largest opposition YouTube channels have a viewership of about 70% of the Russian audience. That is, those citizens who live in Russia, and this is a very important resource for us. And we are, of course, thinking a lot about to circumvent censorship, how to come up with different ways of getting our information to our fellow citizens. And we see the need amongst our compatriots in Russia for access to alternative sources of information. So yes, we do have some options. Although, of course, these opportunities have diminished greatly since the war began. I mean, it is impossible to be in Russia today and to criticize the authorities, to call the war a war and still be free. If you openly criticize the authorities, this is in fact equivalent to committing a crime. So either you go to jail or leave the country, or first you go to jail and then you're deported from Russia.
That's what my next question is related to, by the way. I sometimes see videos on YouTube where people criticize the Russian government, the system, and to a lesser extent the president. To a lesser extent. But still, he gets a little bit of flack too. And I have a question in this regard, because for some reason these people did not go to prison, to a penal colony, as you or your colleagues did. Where is the fine line between criticism and not going to prison, and criticism and the threat of going to prison cell?
И угрозой попасть вот в места не столь отдаленные.
Look, there is no guesswork here at all. Anyone can be sent to jail, even if they aren't a politician or a political activist. Just the other day, there was news that a man was jailed for taking part in a street poll conducted by our colleagues from Radio Liberty. I mean, just a street poll. People were approached with microphones in early days of the war and asked how they felt about the war. A man spoke out against it and they tracked him down and sent him to jail, even though he was just a passerby. For example, in Vladimir, there is an elderly man named Simonov, whom we discovered by chance in Butyrskaya prison before his trial. He was arrested for leaving some anti-war comments on one of the social networks. There are many people, teachers, policemen, doctors, engineers, workers, who simply spoke out against the war in private conversations. They are all sent to jail. There are people who criticize the authorities and allow themselves some front-running, but at the same time they go to the presidential administration and coordinate their position. We even have such parties which, in general, try to balance and are in dialogue with presidential administration. They are allowed a certain freedom of action, but they are not allowed to cross certain lines. This system is quite complex. The state itself looks primitive because you see propagandists like Kiselyov and Solovyov who say very straightforward things. But in fact, during his 25 years in power, almost 25 years, Putin has built up quite a complex, multi-level system of manipulation of public opinion, propaganda and control over society at many different levels.
Please tell me, in that case, is it possible that these people who criticize the current government are just another project of the law enforcement agencies, just to show others that we have freedom of speech, we criticize the government and so on?
I don't know anything about it. I can admit that there might be some projects like this theoretically, but I haven't taken a closer look at them yet, so it's hard for me to comment on that.
Okay, good. Ilya, you've proven that you actually can and in fact are willing to take and have taken responsibility for your words and your beliefs. And here's the question then. You said that in this tough argument with Putin, you would have the moral aspect on your side. But what if the other side, specifically Putin, has no moral bias at all?
The point is, I'm not appealing to Putin, but to Russian society. It is clear that discussion with Putin makes sense only in public aspect. It is clear that I can neither convince Putin of anything, nor can Putin convince me of anything. We are political opponents. Public discussions are held in order to shape or change public opinion. So it has always been very important to me that I have the moral high ground in any discussion with Putin. so that people understand that when I make accusations against Putin, when I make claims against this government, I speak from the position of this moral high ground. That's exactly why I stayed in Russia, criticized the war loudly, clearly, quite clearly, and continued to do so behind bars, and continue to do so now, after my deportation. And the claims that the authorities make against me, I think, don't sound very convincing when they call me a foreign agent. But what kind of a foreign agent am I if I refused to leave Russia? I preferred to go to prison and you had to forcibly remove me from my country. I was literally expelled. So what kind of a foreign agent am I? It is you who is the foreign agent, because it is you, Putin, who serves the interests of China and is turning our country into a Chinese petrol station.
Do you think Western countries have a clear understanding of who Putin is and how to deal with him?
I would be very surprised if, after the invasion of Ukraine, anyone still harbored any illusions about Putin. And I think everybody in the West and in the world in general has already realized that Putin is a person who perceives any compromise, any softness as weakness. You can talk to Putin from a position of strength, and Putin needs to feel the strength of his opponent, feel the decisiveness of his opponent. As in the case of China, for example. My comrade Boris Nemtsov, who was shot dead in front of the Kremlin in 2015, said it very correctly in his time. He said, "We lose to Putin every time because every single time we underestimate the degree of his sluggishness, we degree of his detachment." And he always plays on that. So Putin doesn't shy away from anything, no matter what the cost of the next political step is, no matter how much blood has to be spilled, no matter what destruction, no matter what costs are involved, he does it. Remember this discussion on the eve of the 24th of February, the war in Ukraine? It's impossible, he's not really going to go to Kyiv. Okay, yes, there are a large concentration of forces on the border, but it's probably a bluff. He's a reasonable person, there is no way he's going to start a war.
Кстати, президента Байдена, у которого, насколько я понимаю, были данные американских спецслужб, который там ошибся с датой вторжения буквально там на несколько дней. Ну, практически все эксперты говорили, это блеф, это невозможно, но Путин это сделал. И надо всегда в диалоге с Путиным и в понимании Путина исходить из того, что он может делать вообще все, что угодно. Никаких ограничений у этого человека давно нет.
Look, then the next question. Just the other day, the IMF announced that it has decided to resume cooperation with Russia. After that, some EU countries, 9 EU countries, including the Baltic states, Lithuania, Poland, criticized this decision, opposed it. As a result, the IMF postponed this decision on cooperation with Russia. But the fact remains that a large international organization has expressed its desire to cooperate, to resume cooperation with Russia. How do you assess this fact? Could this be some kind of preparation for some possible negotiations?
Организация изъявила, в общем-то, по сути, желание сотрудничать, возобновить сотрудничество с Россией. Как вы оцениваете такой факт? Может ли это быть какой-то подготовкой, каким-то возможным переговорам?
Everyone, absolutely all the experts, journalists and politicians were talking about it, with the exception, by the way, of President Biden, who, as far as I understand, had data from the American intelligence services who got the date of the invasion wrong by just a few days. Almost all the experts said it was a bluff. It was impossible. But Putin did it, and we should always assume in dialogue with Putin and in understanding Putin that he can do anything he wants. This man has had no limitations for a long time. I don't think we should overestimate this event in any way. I think it's clear that as long as there is a war and as long as peace talks have not started, or as long as Russian soldiers have not left Ukrainian soil, I doubt very much that any major international organization or any interstate structures will seriously cooperate with Russia in a way that would allow Russia to derive any economic benefits from it. It's clear that the main priority at the international level right now is not to feed Putin's war machine. We cannot allow international organization, any Western bodies, to support the operations of Putin's war machine in one way or another. Therefore, as long as the war is going on, it seems to me that the opposition to such attempts to cooperate with Putin's structures will be very strong, in Eastern Europe and in the West. in Western Europe. I think the opposition will be quite strong. And the question of what will happen next depends on how and when the war ends. Of course, Russia cannot be ignored. Russia is a huge country, it's 1/8 of the world's landmass, it's tens of millions of people, and it is understandable that it is impossible to ignore Russia, to fence it off somehow. In the end, we will have to interact with Russia in some way. But it seems to me that the Western countries and the whole civilized world should proceed from the fact that Russia should turn into a normal civilized community. Not to fence Russia off, but to support those forces that oppose Putin, that take an anti-war, pro-democracy stance, and to stimulate Russia's movement toward democracy. I think the whole world is interested in this.
That's a very good note to end this interview with. Ilya, thank you so much for joining us, and I really hope to see you again here.
Thank you.
And I would like to remind our viewers that our guest for today was a Russian opposition politician, Ilya Yashin. You're watching TVP World. Stay with us.